In the glittering ballrooms of Mayfair, a smile is merely a weapon, and a vow is often a silken noose. But on the jagged, wind-scourged cliffs of Devon, the shadows hold secrets far more lethal than a ruined reputation. Step inside Blackwood Manor, where a silent child scribbles tales of blood, a brooding earl wears the moniker of a monster, and a penniless governess must risk her life and her heart in a scandalous game of deception. If you find yourself lost in this tale of fire and truth, subscribe for the next chapter. Tell us in the comments, would you choose duty or desire? Chapter 1. The Silent Cage. The sea did not merely lap at the base of Blackwood Manor, it clawed at it. From the shaking interior of the hackney coach, Clara Brandon pressed her gloved fingertips against the cold glass, watching the silhouette of the estate rise like a fractured crown against the bruised Devon sky. It was a grim, towering Gothic monstrosity perched precariously over jagged cliffs, its dark stone weeping with the salt spray of the Atlantic. The wind howled through the crags, a low, mournful sound that felt uncomfortably like a warning. Clara swallowed the dry lump of apprehension in her throat and smoothed the front of her drab, charcoal wool gown. The fabric was cheap, stiff, and offered little comfort against the damp chill creeping through the carriage floorboards. She had only her trunk, her recommendations, and £20 to her name. After her father's debts had dissolved their modest estate, independence was no longer a choice. It was a cage of a different sort. And according to the agency in London, Blackwood Manor was her last resort. The carriage groaned to a halt. The footman who opened the door did not offer a smile, nor did he linger to assist her. He simply deposited her trunk upon the rain-slicked gravel and scrambled back onto the box, eager to flee the shadow of the house. Clara drew herself up to her full height, ignoring the tremble in her knees, and ascended the massive stone steps. The interior of the manor was no more welcoming than its facade. The air inside smelled of beeswax, old damp, and the bitter tang of woodsmith failed to warm the cavernous entrance hall. The servants she passed moved like ghosts, pale, tight-lipped, their eyes resolutely downcast. When Clara offered a polite greeting to the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, the woman merely gave a curt nod, her keys clinking aggressively against her apron, as if the very sound could ward off evil. "His lordship will see you in the library," Mrs. Gable muttered, her voice tight with an unspoken urgency. "Directly." Clara followed the woman through a labyrinth of dimly lit corridors, her gaze drifting over the heavy tapestries that shivered in the draughts. The house felt suffocatingly silent, yet it hummed with a strange latent vibration, like a breath held too long. When the library doors swung open, Clara's breath caught. Gideon Vance, the Earl of Blackwood, stood by the towering arched window, staring out at the roiling sea. He was a man etched entirely in shadows. When he turned, the flickering light of the hearth caught the sharp, devastating planes of his face. He was unnervingly handsome, but it was a severe, dangerous beauty. Dark hair, streaked with premature silver at the temples, framed a brow that seemed perpetually furrowed. His eyes, a piercing, stormy grey, swept over her with the cold calculation of a judge pronouncing a sentence. Society whispered terrible things about this man. In London, the salons buzzed with the rumour that his late Countess had not succumbed to a sudden ague, but had instead found her end at the tip of his blade or the bottom of the cliffs. They called him the Beast of Devon. Looking at him now, noting the rigid set of his broad shoulders and the absolute stillness of his posture, Clara could see why. He radiated an absolute, terrifying power. "Miss Brandon," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that vibrated straight through the soles of her boots. "You are younger than I anticipated." "I assure you, my lord, my youth does not mitigate my competence," Clara replied, keeping her countenance perfectly composed despite the furious racing of her pulse. "I have managed the education of 3 high-born children in my previous position." "Maeve is not those children," Gideon said flatly, stepping away from the window. He moved with a predatory, feline grace that made the spacious library feel suddenly very small. "She does not require French verbs or the pianoforte. She requires breaking. She is wild, unruly, and utterly mute. The agency assured me you possessed a resilient disposition." "I do, my lord. But I believe in patience, not breaking." A dark, mocking smile touched Gideon's lips, though it did not reach his cold eyes. Patience is a luxury Blackwood Manor does not afford, Miss Brandon. See to it that she does not disrupt the household. That is your primary directive." The interview was dismissed with a wave of his hand, leaving Clara with a hollow ache of apprehension in her chest. That evening, Clara met her charge. Lady Maeve was a slip of a girl, perhaps 8 years old, with tangled dark hair and fierce, feral eyes. When Clara entered the schoolroom, the child did not look up from the floor, where she was methodically tearing the pages out of an expensive leather-bound book. When Clara gently reached out a hand, Maeve lunged, her small teeth baring in a silent, desperate snarl, before retreating to the darkest corner of the room like a cornered animal. It was not the rebellion of a spoiled brat, Clara realized with a pang of deep empathy. It was the frantic, trembling defense of a creature that expected to be struck. Hours later, the storm outside reached a crescendo, the rain lashing against Clara's bedchamber windows like handfuls of gravel. The constraints of her stays felt tighter than usual, the heavy Victorian drapes suffocating her. Sleep was a distant impossibility. She lay awake, listening to the house groan, her mind spinning with the image of the Earl's severe face and the child's haunted eyes. A soft, scraping sound near the floorboards shattered the silence. Clara sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The heavy velvet curtain beside her wardrobe shifted. A small, pale figure slipped out into the flickering light of the single candle Clara had left burning. It was Maeve. The girl was clad in a thin white nightgown, her bare feet blue with the cold. "Maeve?" Clara breathed, sliding out of bed. The freezing floorboards stung her feet. "What is it, child? Are you cold?" The girl did not speak. Her lower lip trembled violently, and her chest heaved with shallow, terrified breaths. She reached into the folds of her nightgown and pulled out a small, rectangular object. It was a secret slate board, the kind used by schoolboys, a piece of chalk dangling from it by a frayed string. With frantic, trembling fingers, Maeve began to write. The screech of the chalk against the slate was agonizingly loud in the quiet room. When she finished, she thrust the board toward Clara's face. Clara looked down. Written in a jagged, desperate scrawl were words that turned the blood in her veins to ice. The last lady didn't leave. The walls ate her. He bled her. Maeve looked up, her large dark eyes swimming with a quiet, deep-seated terror that no child should ever know. She pointed a single shaking finger toward the ceiling, toward the master suite where the Earl slept. Chapter 2. The Monster's Bargain. The slate board clattered to the floor, the chalk snapping into 2 clean pieces that rolled across the cold floorboards. Clara stood frozen, the phantom echo of the child's written words searing themselves into her mind. He bled her. Maeve stared up at her for one heart-stopping second, her tiny frame shivering beneath her thin cotton nightgown, before she turned and bolted back into the shadows of the corridor like a frightened doe. Clara did not chase her. Instead, she fell back against the mattress, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as a hollow ache of pure, unadulterated panic bloomed in her chest. The rumours were not merely the malicious gossip of bored London debutantes. They were a reality etched in chalk. The previous governess had not abruptly resigned to care for a sick relative in Wales. She was dead, her blood staining the very foundations of this wretched house. And Clara was locked inside with her executioner. By the time the first pale, watery rays of dawn pierced the heavy sea fog, Clara had made her decision. Independence was a noble pursuit, but survival was a necessity. She would not let this house consume her. With frantic, trembling hands, she stuffed her meagre belongings back into her trunk. She did not bother to smooth her wrinkled linen or fold her drab wool gowns. She packed with the desperate urgency of a woman fleeing a burning building. Every creak of the old floorboards sounded like a footstep. Every howl of the wind outside sounded like the roar of the beast of Devon coming to claim his next victim. Lugging her heavy iron-bound trunk down the grand sweeping staircase of the foyer, Clara's breath caught in her throat. The entrance hall was cavernous, smelling of damp stone and dying embers. She reached the massive oak front doors, her fingers wrapping around the iron handle, when a voice cut through the gloom like a striking blade. "Leaving so soon, Miss Brandon? And without breakfast?" Clara whirled around, her back slamming against the heavy wood of the door. Gideon Vance stood at the base of the stairs. He wore no coat, only a loose white linen shirt open at the collar and a dark waistcoat. His sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms dusted with dark hair. In the dim morning light, his severe countenance looked entirely demonic. He closed the distance between them with that smooth, predatory stride, his stormy grey eyes locked onto her pale face. "I am resigning my position, my lord," Clara said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to project an aura of unyielding propriety. She gripped the fabric of her skirt, her knuckles white. "I find the air of Devon does not agree with my health." "Do not lie to me," Gideon hissed, stepping into her personal space. He was towering, massive, completely eclipsing the light from the side windows. He reached out, his large hand slamming against the oak door right beside her head, trapping her between his body and the wood. The scent of rain, cedarwood, and clean sweat washed over her. "You look as though you have seen a ghost." "Perhaps I have," Clara cried, the terror giving way to a sudden, volatile burst of defiance. She looked him dead in the eye, refusing to flinch. "I know what you did to her, Lord Blackwood. I know the last lady did not leave. You killed her. You bled her in these very halls." She expected him to strike her. She expected the wrath of a murderer caught in his lie. Instead, Gideon flinched as if she had struck him. The terrifying mask of the severe Earl cracked, and beneath it, Clara saw something that shocked her to her absolute core, a desperate, bleeding vulnerability. His jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek, and his grey eyes clouded with an agonizing, profound grief. He dropped his hand from the door, stepping back a pace, his shoulders sagging slightly under a weight she could not see. "So," he whispered, his voice suddenly hollow, rough with emotion. "They have poisoned the child's mind against me as well. Or perhaps she saw something she was never meant to see." Clara watched him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "What do you mean?" "I did not kill Miss Harrison," Gideon said, looking out toward the bleak fog rolling against the windows. "I swear it to you on my soul, Miss Brandon, though I know you have no reason to believe the word of a monster. She vanished overnight 3 weeks ago. I woke to find her rooms empty, her belongings intact, and within 48 hours, the rumours began in London. Someone is systematically destroying my name. They want the world to believe I am a Bluebeard, a madman who slaughters women in the dark, so that the Crown will strip me of my title and my lands." "And Maeve," Clara breathed, the tight constraints of her corset suddenly feeling a little less suffocating as she listened. Why would she write such things? "Because she found Miss Harrison's blood," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. He turned back to Clara, his eyes burning with a fierce, terrifying intensity. "Because the real killer is still inside this house, Miss Brandon, walking these halls, dining at my table. They are terrorizing my niece to keep her silent, and they are framing me for the deed." Clara stared at him, caught in an exquisite, torturous limbo of doubt. He was a master of high society. He could be manipulating her with the practiced ease of a villain. Yet the raw agony in his eyes felt too real, too human, to be a mere performance. Gideon stepped close to her once more, his presence overwhelming, but this time he did not trap her. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from her cheek, hesitating before dropping away. "I cannot fight a phantom in the dark alone," he pleaded, his voice a low, seductive rumble that sent a strange, electric shiver down Clara's spine. "I need an ally. I need a bait." "A bait," Clara echoed, her breath hitching. "Help me draw the monster out," Gideon whispered, his eyes dropping to her lips before rising back to her gaze. "If the killer thinks I am falling for you, if they believe you are to be my next Countess, they will strike again to finish the frame. Let me court you publicly. Let the world, and whoever resides in these walls, think you are my next victim. I will surround you with guards. I will watch over you every second of the night. I will protect you with my life." He extended his hand, palm up, waiting. "Let me court you, Clara. Help me save my child, and I will give you anything you desire." Clara looked at his hand, large, calloused, capable of crushing her, yet trembling ever so slightly with a desperate plea for salvation. She looked up into the storm of his eyes and felt a dangerous, terrifying heat kindle deep within her belly. She was a penniless governess, standing on the precipice of ruin or death. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her small gloved hand into his. Chapter 3. The Luxury of Danger. The transformation was nothing short of a gilded, violent shock. Within 48 hours of their unholy alliance, Clara's drab, scratchy charcoal wools were banished to the back of the wardrobe. In their place arrived trunks from London, overflowing with the finest silks, velvets, and laces that money could buy. When she looked in the cheval glass on the evening of the Lord Lieutenant's autumn ball, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The gown was a scandal in itself, a deep, blood-red silk that clung to the curves of her waist, the décolletage dipping just low enough to expose the pale, smooth expanse of her throat, where a heavy, shimmering emerald necklace rested like a collar of fire. "You look magnificent," Gideon murmured from the doorway of the drawing-room. Clara turned, her breath hitching. The Earl was dressed in impeccable evening black, his severe features stark against the pristine white of his cravat. As he stepped toward her, the forced proximity of their ruse felt instantly overwhelming. The scent of sandalwood and wet rain clung to him, an intoxicating musk that made Clara's pulse leap in a frantic, unseemly rhythm. "I feel like an imposter," Clara whispered, her fingers nervously smoothing the heavy silk of her skirts. "High society will see right through this. A common governess paraded as a peer's obsession. Then we must give them a performance they cannot possibly doubt," Gideon replied, his voice a low, gravelly timbre. He closed the distance between them, his eyes darkening as they swept over her exposed collarbones. Without a word of warning, he reached out and slid his large, warm hand around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. An electric shock crackled through the small space between them. Clara's hands instinctively flew to his broad shoulders to steady herself. Her breath caught in her throat as his head tilted downward, his lips brushing so tantalizingly close to the sensitive skin of her neck that she could feel the heat of his breath. "Smile, my sweet Clara," he whispered against her skin, a mock endearment that sent a fierce, aching shiver cascading down her spine. "They must think I am utterly consumed by you." The Devon ball was a battlefield of whispers. As Gideon led Clara into the grand ballroom, the music seemed to falter beneath the weight of 100 gasping breath. The matrons adjusted their quizzing glasses, their countenances twisting in horrified fascination as the infamous Beast of Devon paraded his young ward's governess like a prized jewel. When the orchestra struck up a sweeping, breathless waltz, Gideon hauled her into his arms. He did not dance with the polite distance required by decorum. His grip on her waist was possessive, bruisingly tight, anchoring her to him as they spun through the glittering crowd. Every time their eyes met, his heavy, smouldering gaze made her knees weak. To the watching world, he was a man driven mad by infatuation. To Clara, it felt entirely too real. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not from fear of the phantom killer, but from the terrifyingly fierce hunger blooming in her own body. Yet, when the music stopped and the masks fell, the darkness of Blackwood Manor always reclaimed them. Late into the night, while the rest of the household slept, Clara and Gideon confined themselves to the candlelit sanctuary of the library. The glamorous silks were cast aside for simpler wraps, but the tension between them only thickened. Together they bent over the estate's old ledgers, searching for any discrepancies, any trace of the vanished Miss Harrison, or any hint of who was draining the Blackwood coffers. "Look here," Clara murmured, her finger tracing a line of ink in the ledger. She was exhausted, the dark circles under her eyes masked only by the dimming candlelight. Gideon was sitting so close their shoulders brushed, his sleeve rolled up, his dark eyes focused intensely on the page. "There are massive, recurring payments made to a London solicitor, entirely unauthorized by your signature." "A forgery," Gideon growled, his jaw tightening. He looked up, his face mere inches from hers. The severe, brooding lines of his countenance relaxed for a fraction of a second, replaced by a profound, heavy wariness. "You are too clever for your own good, Clara. If the killer realizes what you are finding—" "Let them try," Clara said softly, surprised by her own bravery. Gideon's gaze softened, turning intense, heavy with an unvarnished yearning. He reached out, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw, his touch surprisingly tender for a man so feared. For a breathless moment, the ghost of her murdered predecessor faded into the background. Clara leaned into his touch, her lips parting, aching for the weight of his mouth against hers. Her mind screamed that he might still be a master manipulator, a monster spinning a web, but her body rejected the warning, desperate for the fire he offered. Just as his head began to lower, a sudden sharp creak echoed from the corridor outside. Gideon instantly froze. In a flash, his tender gaze vanished, replaced by the lethal sharpness of a predator. He blew out the candle, plunging the library into absolute suffocating darkness, his hands silently wrapping around the hilt of the dagger concealed within his waistcoat. The game was no longer a mere ruse. The trap was set, and the monster in the dark was finally beginning to circle. Chapter 4. The Twist. The Secret of the Cradle. The rain had ceased, but the sea fog that crept into the west wing of Blackwood Manor was thick enough to swallow the pale light of the moon. This part of the estate had been locked for a decade, a decaying labyrinth of sheeted furniture, smelling of dry rot and old lavender. It was here that Miss Harrison had slept, isolated from the rest of the household, in a room that felt more like a tomb than a bedchamber. Clara moved silently, her hand guiding a flickering brass chamber candlestick. Beside her, Maeve walked like a ghost, her small fingers gripping the hem of Clara's heavy green velvet skirt. The child had grown fiercely attached to her, her feral defences melting away in the warmth of Clara's patience. Maeve stopped suddenly before a dusty, moth-eaten tapestry depicting a hunting scene. Her dark eyes, usually wide with fear, held a sudden, sharp intelligence. She looked up at Clara, placed a single finger over her lips, and then reached behind the heavy woven fabric. "Maeve, what is it?" Clara whispered, her heart executing a nervous flutter against her ribs. The child didn't answer with words, but with action. She pressed her small weight against a specific stone in the panelled wall. With a low, grinding groan, a loose brick shifted backward. Maeve reached into the dark cavity and pulled out a small, leather-bound volume warped by the damp. It was Miss Harrison's diary. Clara sank onto a dust-sheeted settee, her hands trembling as she pried open the mildewed pages. The handwriting was frantic, spilling across the paper in an erratic scrawl that mirrored the terror Clara had felt on her own first night. She skimmed past the early entries detailing the loneliness of the coast, searching for the moment the woman's fate had been sealed. Then, a passage jumped out, the ink dark and heavy. "I have found the parish records hidden in the old cradle in the nursery attic. God forgive me, I know the truth now. Lady Maeve is no niece. She is Lord Blackwood's legitimate daughter, born in secret during his youth in Spain to the late Condesa de la Vega. The marriage was legally binding under both Catholic and English law. Gideon Vance has a rightful heir." Clara gasped, the book nearly slipping from her fingers. Maeve was not a ward. She was the future Countess of Blackwood. But why the secrecy? Why would Gideon hide his own flesh and blood? As if answering her unspoken thought, the next line of the diary revealed the horrific catalyst. "If the world learns of Maeve's legitimacy, Richard's claim to the earldom is utterly destroyed. He knows I found the papers. He knows I intend to take the child and flee to London. I can hear him outside my door now. The latch is turning." The entry ended in a violent smudge of ink. A cold, paralysing dread washed over Clara. Gideon was innocent. The Beast of Devon was nothing more than a scapegoat, a shadow painted by a master manipulator. The real monster was not the brooding man who held her tight in the ballroom, but the saintly, soft-spoken cousin, Richard Vance, who managed the estate's finances with a polite smile and a treacherous heart. Richard had been systematically terrorizing Maeve, forcing her into a silent cage of trauma so she could never speak the truth of her parentage. And he had murdered Miss Harrison when she tried to save the child. A fascinating piece of literature, is it not, Miss Brandon? The voice was mild, smooth, and entirely devoid of warmth. Clara whirled around, shielding Maeve instinctively behind her skirts. Standing in the doorway of the abandoned bedchamber was Richard Vance. He wore a heavy travelling cloak, his handsome face composed in its usual expression of gentle concern. But in his right hand, the silver hilt of a heavy pistol caught the weak candlelight. "Mr. Vance," Clara said, her voice dropping into a dangerous stillness, though every nerve in her body screamed to run. "You are late for dinner. And you are entirely too inquisitive for a governess. Richard replied, stepping into the room with an easy, terrifying nonchalance. "My cousin has always had a weakness for beautiful, sharp-witted women. He fancied himself a protector, parading you around the county to draw out a phantom. How tragic it will be when that phantom frames him a second time, and this time leaves no doubt of his madness." He levelled the pistol directly at Clara's chest. The storm outside chose that exact moment to break, a crack of thunder shaking the very glass in the windows, plunging the manor into a night of violent reckonings. Chapter 5. The Vow of the Cliffs. The gale hit Blackwood Manor with the force of a battering ram. Outside, the Atlantic churned into a boiling froth, throwing massive waves against the cliffs that shuddered through the ancient foundations of the house. Inside the West Wing Tower, the air was freezing, smelling of ozone, old dust, and the metallic tang of absolute terror. "Move," Richard commanded, his voice a chillingly polite whisper that cut through the roaring wind. He gestured with the heavy pistol, forcing Clara and Maeve backward up the narrow, winding stone stairs that led to the high tower parapet. "A tragic suicide, Miss Brandon. The pressure of being the Earl's temporary obsession, the crushing guilt of discovering his monstrous nature. Society will weep for you, and Gideon will finally dangle from a hangman's noose." Clara kept her arm tightly wrapped around Maeve, shielding the trembling child against her side. Her leather slippers slipped on the damp, cold stone steps. Her mind raced, searching for any weapon, any distraction, but the constraints of her heavy velvet gown felt like a trap in themselves. They burst out onto the roof of the tower. The storm slammed into them like a physical blow. Rain lashed Clara's face, instantly blinding her, tearing her hair from its pins until the wet, dark curls whipped wildly across her eyes. Below them, 100 feet down, the sea roared against the jagged rocks. "Let the child go, Richard!" Clara screamed over the tempest, her back pressed against the low, rain-slicked stone parapet. "She cannot speak. She is no threat to you." "She is a living testament to my fraud," Richard shouted back, his saintly facade completely replaced by a manic, desperate malice. He stepped forward, his fingers tightening on the trigger. "And tonight, the Vance bloodline ends with—" The heavy oak door to the tower didn't just open, it exploded off its hinges. Gideon Vance stormed onto the roof like a manifestation of the storm itself. His coat was gone, his white linen shirt soaked through and clinging to his broad chest. His severe face was contorted into a mask of pure, lethal rage. "Richard!" Gideon roared. Richard whirled, startled by the intrusion, and fired. The loud report of the pistol cracked through the thunder, a flash of fire illuminating the dark. The ball grazed Gideon's cheek, drawing a line of bright crimson, but it did not slow him down. Gideon lunged across the slick stone, tackling his cousin with a brutal, animalistic ferocity. What followed was a breathless, desperate struggle for survival. The two men rolled across the rain-washed parapet, striking each other with bone-crushing force. Richard, realizing he was outmatched by the Earl's raw strength, drew a concealed, thin stiletto blade from his boot. He swung wildly, the silver steel flashing in the gloom. "Gideon, watch out!" Clara cried, trying to push Maeve safely into the stairwell. Richard lunged forward, aiming the blade directly at Clara's throat in a final spiteful act of destruction. Gideon did not hesitate. With a guttural roar, he threw his own massive body in front of Clara. The blade sank deep into Gideon's shoulder. He groaned, a sound of pure agony, but his grip did not slacken. He used his remaining strength to pin Richard against the stone wall, just as the heavy, frantic footsteps of the estate guards echoed up the stairs. Within seconds, Richard was swarmed, his blade wrenched away, and his arms pinned back in heavy iron chains. As they dragged him into the dark, his curses were swallowed by the roaring wind. Gideon collapsed to his knees, his blood mixing with the rainwater pooling on the stone. "Gideon!" Clara dropped to her knees beside him, her hands instantly flying to his wound. The warm, thick crimson fluid spilled over her fingers, ruining her expensive velvet gown, but she didn't care. A hollow, agonizing ache broke wide open in her chest. "Stay with me. Please, Gideon, look at me." Gideon raised his head, his stormy grey eyes cloudy with pain, but burning with an unshielded, desperate intensity. He reached up with his uninjured arm, his large, calloused hand wrapping around the back of her neck, pulling her forehead down to touch his. "I told you," he whispered, his breath hot against her cold lips. I would protect you with my life. 3 weeks later, the sun did something it rarely accomplished in Devon. It shone. The master bedroom of Blackwood Manor was bathed in a warm golden light, the heavy velvet drapes thrown wide to reveal a calm, sparkling sapphire sea. Gideon sat propped up against the down pillows, his shoulder heavily bandaged beneath a loose silk robe. The severe, brooding lines of his countenance had softened, replaced by a peace he had not known in a decade. Clara stood by the window, no longer dressed in the drab wool of a servant, nor the scandalous red silk of a bait. She wore a simple, elegant gown of pale lavender. A soft tap at the door broke the quiet. Maeve tiptoed into the room, her hair neatly brushed, her eyes entirely clear of the terror that had once paralyzed her. She walked up to the side of the bed, looked at Gideon, and then took Clara's hand. The child took a deep, steady breath. Her chest heaved, and then a sound broke from her lips, small, fragile, but perfectly clear. "Stay," Maeve whispered, looking directly into Clara's eyes. "Please, stay, Mama." Tears blurred Clara's vision as she sank to her knees, pulling the little girl into a fierce, weeping embrace. Over the child's shoulder, she met Gideon's gaze. The stormy grey was gone, replaced by a profound, molten heat that made her heart leap. Gideon reached out, his long fingers catching Clara's wrist and gently pulling her onto the edge of the mattress. Maeve giggled, slipping out of the room to leave them in their hard-won sanctuary. "You heard the Countess," Gideon murmured, his voice a low, seductive rumble that vibrated straight through Clara's soul. He closed the distance between them, his hand tangling in her unruly curls, tilting her face up to his. "You cannot leave us now, Clara. The fake vows we whispered in those crowded ballrooms, I mean to make them real. I mean to spend the rest of my days proving to you that the beast of Devon is entirely yours." His mouth descended upon hers. It was not the performative, possessive touch of their ruse, but a deep, fierce, and unshielded declaration of love. Clara melted into him, her hands wrapping around his neck, finally free of the silent cage, knowing with absolute certainty that the most dangerous man on the moors was the only one who could truly keep her safe. As the sun dips below the rugged Devon horizon, bleeding gold and violet into the eternal sea, the shadows of Blackwood Manor finally retreat into the past. For love is not found in the absence of danger, but in the fierce, unyielding courage to face the dark together and find a sanctuary in the arms of the one who was willing to bleed to keep you whole. If this tale of fire, truth, and dangerous redemption has captured your soul, subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next romance. Tell us in the comments below, would you have stayed at Blackwood Manor to uncover the truth?